farmhouse was quiet that night, save for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. I had spent the evening as I always did, alone, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea and watching the fire burn low in the hearth. Outside, snow had piled up, muffling the world and isolating me further. At first, I welcomed the solitude. The farmhouse had been my family's for generations, and despite its creaking walls and dim corners, it was my retreat. But as the hours ticked toward midnight, unease began to creep in. I remember the exact moment the sense of dread started. It wasn't anything obvious, just a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The fire hissed more often, spitting embers as though agitated. The shadows on the walls seemed darker, heavier, and the tick of the clock grew louder, more insistent. Then I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps against the wooden door, cutting through the stillness like a knife. I froze. The farmhouse was miles from the nearest neighbor, and no one had any reason to visit me, especially not on New Year's Eve. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a strange scraping sound like claws on wood. For a long moment I didn't move, didn't breathe. The firelight flickered, casting jittery shapes across the walls, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe a stray animal. But as I edged closer to the door, peeking through the frosted glass of the sidelight, my blood ran cold. The footprints leading to my porch weren't human. They were large, clawed, and uneven, as though the creature that made them had a loping, unbalanced gait. The snow around them was blackened, as though scorched, and steam curled faintly from each impression. I couldn't imagine anything alive in this world that could leave such marks. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. No response. The scraping sound came again, this time directly against the door. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it locked, but something about the knock, its rhythm, its persistence, held me in place. It was deliberate, purposeful, as though the thing on the other side knew me. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its resonant clang echoing through the empty house. As if on cue, the knocking stopped. For a brief, blessed moment, there was silence. Then, just as I began to relax, the door creaked open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. But the door swung inward, revealing nothing but the icy darkness outside. The snow-covered porch was empty, the footprints leading up to it vanishing abruptly at the threshold. My breath fogged in the frigid air as I stared out into the night. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind, but it carried a strange undercurrent, a faint whisper that I couldn't quite make out. It almost sounded like my name. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle as though it were studying me. Before I could slam the door, it took a single step forward. The blackened snow hissed beneath its weight, and the whisper on the wind grew louder. I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, my hands trembling so violently that it took 3 tries. The heavy wood shut out the sight of the figure, but not its presence. It was still out there. I could feel it, an oppressive weight pressing against the walls of the house. My mind raced. Should I call someone? The nearest sheriff's office was 20 miles away, and cell service this far out was spotty at best. Even if I managed to get through, what could I say? That there was a thing standing in my yard watching me? The fire crackled behind me, pulling me out of my thoughts. I turned, hoping its warmth would offer some comfort, but the room felt colder than ever. The flames had dwindled to a faint glow, their light barely illuminating the room. The shadows on the walls were wrong, too sharp, too deep. I checked the windows, pulling the curtains tight against the night. My breath hitched as I caught a glimpse of movement outside, a flicker of something darting between the trees. It wasn't just in the yard anymore. It was circling the house. The sound came next, a faint scraping, like nails dragging across glass. It started at the back window, then moved to the side of the house, slow and deliberate. I followed it as best I could, creeping from room to room, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the kitchen, the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but instead I heard something worse. Footsteps. Inside. They were soft at first, barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. But they grew louder, heavier, until they sounded impossibly close. "Who's there?" I demanded, grabbing the fireplace poker from the hearth. My voice echoed weakly through the empty house, met only by the oppressive silence. I crept toward the hall, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but the air was heavy with something unspoken, a tension that made every hair on my body stand on end. As I rounded the corner, I froze. The front door was open again, swinging lazily on its hinges. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the snow, was the figure. It stepped inside. The figure moved with a grotesque grace, its elongated limbs bending in ways that defied nature. The sound of its footsteps, soft yet deliberate, filled the house as it stepped fully inside, bringing with it a sharp, metallic chill that seeped into the air. I gripped the fireplace poker tighter, my knuckles white, my breathing shallow. It stood in the entryway, its head tilting to one side as though listening to something I couldn't hear. The shadows around it seemed to ripple unnaturally, darkening the hallway as it took another step forward. "What do you want?" My voice came out as a shaky whisper, the question leaving my lips before I could think better of it. The figure stopped. It turned its head toward me, though its face was hidden in the shadows. I could feel its gaze, cold, probing, almost tactile as it pinned me in place. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It spoke. The voice was wrong, layered and echoing, as if 100 whispers were all speaking at once. "First foot crossed." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of its words. The old superstition came rushing back to me, the fragments I had read in an ancient folklore book years ago. The first person to cross the threshold in the new year brings fortune or ruin. But this wasn't a person. "You're not welcome here," I stammered, my voice trembling with false bravado. The figure tilted its head the other way, the motion slow and deliberate. Its outline seemed to blur, the edges of its form shimmering faintly, as though it weren't entirely solid. The air around it grew colder still, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. I took another step forward. Panic surged through me. I swung the poker in a wide arc, the metal whooshing through empty air as the figure moved with inhuman speed, sidestepping effortlessly. It was closer now, standing at the edge of the living room, its towering form dwarfing the furniture. The fire sputtered violently, the flames shrinking until they were no more than embers. The room plunged into near darkness, the faint glow casting grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed on the walls. The thing raised one of its impossibly long arms, pointing a clawed finger toward me. Its voice came again, deeper now, resonating with a force that rattled the very bones of the house. "Crossed the line." A sharp, rhythmic pounding erupted behind me, coming from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It wasn't just sound. It was vibration, a physical pulse that made the air thrum with menace. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the poker as the noise grew deafening. The figure advanced, closing the distance between us in an instant. I could see it clearly now, its form shrouded in a dark, flickering mist. Its face, or what passed for one, was featureless save for a gaping void where a mouth should have been, its edges curling like black smoke. I swung again, desperate, and this time the poker connected. The impact sent a jarring shock up my arm, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned closer, its void-like mouth splitting wider as a wave of freezing air washed over me. "You invited me?" "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I didn't!" The figure paused, its head tilting once more. For a moment, the pounding stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. "You opened The door. The figure's words struck me like a physical blow. The door. It had opened on its own, hadn't it? Or had I somehow invited this thing in? My mind raced, searching for answers, but every thought was drowned out by the suffocating presence of the creature looming before me. It stepped closer, its clawed hand reaching out. The air grew impossibly cold, and I could feel the frost creeping along the floorboards, biting at my bare feet. "No," I whispered, retreating toward the hallway. "You can't be here. You're not welcome." The figure stopped, its hand hovering inches from my face. The shadows around it seemed to pulse in time with its words. "The first foot. Decides the year." "What do you mean?" I demanded, my back pressing against the wall. "What are you?" Its form flickered, dissolving and reforming as it spoke. "A choice. Made long ago. A pact. Forgotten." I shook my head, panic clawing at my chest. None of this made sense. "I didn't make any pact. I didn't..." The thing's voice cut through me like a blade. "Not you. Them." The room shifted, the walls warping as if the house itself were alive, bending under the weight of some unseen force. Memories flooded my mind, fragments of conversations with my grandparents, stories about the old farmhouse and the strange rituals my ancestors had practiced. The first foot. Must cross. The line. My breath hitched as the realization struck. The threshold wasn't just a door. It was a boundary, a barrier between worlds. And by allowing this thing to enter, I had broken it. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. It didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised its clawed hand again, pointing toward the clock in the hall. Midnight had come and gone, but the clock's hands were spinning wildly, blurring together in a chaotic dance. "Restore. Balance," it hissed. Or, "They will come." Before I could ask what it meant, the pounding resumed, louder and more frantic. The house groaned under the weight of the sound, and I could feel the floor buckling beneath me. "What do I have to do?" I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. The thing's featureless face tilted toward the door. The line must close. The first foot must leave. I turned to the open doorway, the snow outside glowing faintly under the moonlight. The footprints that had led to my porch now stretched further, vanishing into the darkness beyond the yard. But they weren't alone. More footprints, hundreds of them, were appearing in the snow, leading toward the house from every direction. The footprints multiplied, converging on the farmhouse like an unholy procession. Each step left behind a scorched imprint in the snow, steaming in the cold night air. The darkness beyond the yard seemed alive, writhing as shadowy forms emerged, their movements slow and deliberate. They were coming. The figure in the house loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the walls like black veins. "Restore. Balance," it repeated, its voice a layered distortion of whispers and growls. The fire in the hearth snuffed out completely, plunging the room into oppressive darkness. The cold became unbearable, and I could hear the faint creak of frost creeping up the walls, splintering the wood beneath its grip. I turned toward the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to make sense of its cryptic demand. "The first foot must leave," it had said. Did it mean the figure? Or was it me? "Tell me how," I yelled, gripping the poker like a lifeline. The thing didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, clawed hand and gestured toward the doorway. Outside, the footprints continued to gather, circling the house as the shadowy figures drew closer. Their outlines were warped and twisted, their heads cocked unnaturally to the side as though straining to hear something. A noise rose from the outside, a low, guttural moan that rippled through the air, vibrating deep in my chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was hunger. "Leave!" the figure hissed, its voice pressing down on me like a physical force. My mind reeled. Was this thing demanding I abandon the house? Or was it instructing me to drive the intruders away? My thoughts were fragmented, panic clawing at me as the moaning outside grew louder, a chorus of unnatural voices blending into a single menacing hum. The footsteps were at the porch now. I could hear the wood creak under the weight of whatever was out there. A claw scraped against the siding, slow and deliberate. Another thud shook the front door. I made my decision. Clutching the poker, I stepped toward the threshold, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I couldn't stay here and let those things break through. The figure watched me, its faceless head tilting slightly as though amused by my choice. I crossed the line. The moment my foot hit the snow, the world shifted violently. The moaning stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. The air thickened, and the farmhouse behind me seemed to dissolve into the shadows. All that remained was the snow-covered field, now devoid of footprints. The figures were gone. I turned to face the house, expecting relief, but the sight before me froze the blood in my veins. The windows of the farmhouse glowed faintly, and in each one a face stared back at me, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. They pressed against the glass, their mouths moving silently, whispering words I couldn't hear. The figure was still inside, standing motionless in the center of the living room. Its form began to dissolve, unraveling into dark mist that snaked along the floor, seeping into the walls. The faces in the windows watched me until the last trace of the figure disappeared. Then, one by one, they vanished too, fading into the darkness as though they had never been there. I stood in the snow, trembling, my breath misting in the freezing air. The farmhouse was silent again, its windows dark and lifeless. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind. Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my grip tightening on the poker, though I knew it would do no good. There, at the edge of the field, stood a single figure. It was different from the others. Smaller, its form human-like but shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, didn't advance. It simply watched. I wanted to call out, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure tilted its head, a gesture so eerily familiar that it sent a fresh wave of dread washing over me. It turned and began to walk away, its movements fluid and deliberate. Its footprints sizzled in the snow, blackened and steaming, just like the ones that had appeared before. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I stood frozen, watching as it disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only silence. When I finally turned back to the farmhouse, I realized the front door was closed, the threshold sealed. The house loomed against the night sky, its outlines stark and foreboding. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like it never had been. As I took a step back, I noticed something on the ground, a single set of footprints leading away from the porch. They were mine, and they ended exactly where I stood.